Hello, everyone. We're just going to give a minute or two for folks to file in. We had quite a number of RSVPs, so we want to make sure everyone's here before we get started. All right, hopefully we have a good group that's joined us. Hello, welcome to today's webinar. I'm Katie Unthank, PAI's Director of Communications. We invited you today to hear an analysis of the global implications the 2024 election will have on sexual and reproductive health and rights, including U.S. policies, programs, and the implications on the global stage and with multilaterals. There's still a lot we don't know regarding who will be in key positions, the specifics of day one policies, etc. But we are eager to share what is known and to reaffirm PAI's role in fighting for rights globally. We have reserved the final 20 minutes for Q&A. Please share your questions for the speakers using the Q&A function on Zoom on the right-hand side of your screen. We will also be recording the webinar and sharing it in the coming days. Today, we're going to hear from three of PAI's experts. First, PAI's Senior Vice President of Program Strategy and Growth, Mustafa Kuradi. We'll also have Rachel Clement, our Senior Director of U.S. Government Strategy. And finally, PAI's Senior Fellow and Policy Analyst, Craig Lasher. We'll start today's webinar by looking back at what we experienced during the first Trump administration and the timeline of events beginning in 2017. We'll then fast forward to today and the landscape in which we currently find ourselves. Rachel would discuss the implications of U.S. election results and the threats to our global work that we expect under this administration. We'll then turn to Craig to analyze foreign aid and how policies under a conservative White House and Congress will impact funding. Finally, Mustafa will explain how this will affect global programs and activities and what PAI will closely monitor for the next 4 years. I will now turn it over to Nabiha Kazi-Hutchins, the President and CEO of PAI.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, and thank you all for joining us today to discuss the implications of the U.S. elections outcome on global sexual and reproductive health and rights. This is a complex and consequential time for our movement, and while much remains to be seen, we do know where the tides are turning, and we knew them well before this election. It's important for me to share that PAI is steadfast in our commitment and resolute in our action plan to advance access to sexual and reproductive health care and embrace and elevate the underpinnings of our collective movement, which are the respect for and the protection of human rights, agency, and autonomy for all people. For 59 years, we have advocated for U.S. and global policies and funding to prioritize, protect, and expand sexual and reproductive health. We do not take U.S. government funding, and that enables us to credibly hold U.S. administrations from both sides of the aisle accountable to deliver on what they promise and what aligns with the desires and preferences of the American people and the needs of the global community. As it relates to reproductive rights and freedoms, over 70% of Americans believe that people should have the right to choose and should have the right to access sexual and reproductive health care on their own terms. And if we need further proof of the will of the American people, we look at states from Kansas to Ohio to Florida and over 10 others that have had ballot measures on reproductive rights. And time again, the majority of people have voted in favor of protecting reproductive rights and freedoms for themselves and their loved ones. Our issue was never a partisan issue. In fact, our movement, once upon a time, had bipartisan political support. I think it's important to recognize that while we have a very tall order ahead of us, we will not let this moment, which is and will be hostile to our movement, define our long game. Today, we have leadership gathered on this webinar representing governments from around the world, multilateral institutions, including UN agencies, major donors who remain on our shared journey, research institutions that bring science, data, and evidence forward, international NGOs that deliver essential services and rely on the support of the US government, civil society and advocacy organizations and coalitions from global North and global South countries, and individuals who are personally invested in and care deeply about our mandate. It is precisely our collective power and collective strength that propel us ahead. Today, we will share our analysis based on the current state of play, the challenges and needs ahead, and what we have an opportunity to shape together. Thank you again for being here. I now hand over to my colleagues, Rachel, Mustafa, and Craig.
Hi, thank you so much for that, Nabiha. I think you've laid the groundwork really nicely. I do want to just note that in some ways we've been here before. When the first Trump administration was in place in 2017, he also enjoyed Republican majorities in both the House and the Senate. However, I think then and now look very differently. We have seen a dramatic shift within the GOP to align with the MAGA agenda. Many of the guardrails and moderating voices that were in the administration and in Congress are no longer there. And we are fundamentally looking at a different scenario with this administration and this makeup of Congress than we were in 2017. In terms of this Congress, here's what we know so far. In the Senate, Republicans have a 53 to 47 majority. There are some moderate Republicans who have sided with Democrats on issues of SRHR, so there is some hope there. There is new leadership in the Senate for the first time in almost 18 years in the form of Senator John Thune. A lot of other familiar faces there. Notably, Senator Susan Collins will be chairing appropriations. She has in the past been fairly strong on SRHR in some ways. And on foreign affairs, Senator Jean Shaheen will be an incredible voice and champion for global SRHR, as she has been for years now. This narrow majority in the Senate does mean that the senators are going to have to be quite aligned, and it may mean that they feel that they have more of a duty to make good on campaign promises and align with the will of their constituents, since about a third of them faced elections this last year. I do think that there are some glimmers of hope in the Senate, but it certainly is not going to be the same Senate that we've seen in the 118th. In the House, right now, Republicans have hit the magical 218 to hold the official majority. There are about 9 races that are still in play. This is basically the same degree of majority that they have currently, but it's important to note that over 60 members of Congress that were part of the 118th retired, passed away, or otherwise left the House. So even though the numbers remain similar, the makeup of who's in those seats has changed. We have seen Republicans try to lead from a slim majority in the House previously and have seen that that has not always gone well, and that there will be areas where they need to negotiate with Democrats and to find consensus among themselves in order to move an agenda forward. At the same time, we have relied heavily on the Senate to mitigate some of the worst policy proposals that have come out of this House, including a lot of the really negative SRHR policy writers. This new Senate majority means that the Senate may not be as likely to push back against some of those policy issues, including some of the so-called culture war issues that most impact women, adolescent girls, and other marginalized groups. In terms of leadership, no big changes there, as it seems that Speaker Mike Johnson will retain his leadership position, and that Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Minority Whip Catherine Clark for the Dems will also retain their leadership positions. On appropriations, Kay Granger from Texas did retire, or is retiring, and handed the gavel off to Tom Cole from Oklahoma. We do have Rosa DeLauro, who has been a strong champion, particularly for children and early childhood education, but also on gender equality and some SRHR issues. So that's a positive sign. And in foreign affairs, new leadership there with Ann Wagner rotating on and Mike McCall rotating out, as he was not granted his waiver to extend his term. I think that does not bode well for many of our issues, given some of her track records on SRHR. And then retaining Meeks, I think there are some strong signs there. I do want to quickly, before we look at the future, just take a quick glance back at the past. During the first Trump administration, we saw a number of actions coming from the executive branch that really affected global sexual reproductive health and rights. One of President Trump's first acts as president was to reimpose the global gag rule and extend it to all global health. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means and what the impacts were. But as a policy signal, it was quite strong. We know that the president has potentially an enormous number of executive orders ready to sign, and anticipate that the reimposition of the global gag rule will be among one of his first acts again. Similarly, very early in his administration, President Trump halted funding to UNFPA, the UN agency responsible for maternal health, reproductive health, among other things. And they were very quick with issuing guidance on the global gag rule and ensuring that it was implemented in March. So not just sort of signing the executive order, but actually getting it done. The other sort of big pieces to look at here are just that there were 3 conservative justices who were confirmed to the Supreme Court. This dramatically shifted the court itself and led to things like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which has been cited globally as a rationale for imposing anti-SRHR policies and laws. The administration also established what they called the Commission on Unalienable Rights, which redefined which rights the United States government would recognize and uphold, specifically targeting sexual reproductive health and rights as rights that were not unalienable. Aligned with that, they removed reproductive rights from the State Department Human Rights Reports, an annual report that the State Department puts out that many rely on to understand sort of country by country what's going on in terms of human rights. Also in 2019, they expanded the global gag rules to include the Organization of American States, testing the waters for even further expansion. And in 2020, even amidst the backdrop of COVID, they signed what they called the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which is an explicitly anti-abortion doctrine that is meant to underline multilateral engagement and ensure that above all other foreign policies, anti-abortion policies are central to what governments are undertaking. Oh my goodness, that was not intended. So as I've sort of alluded to, I think you can see that the implications for policy and personnel are going to be enormous. The incoming administration can look forward to a Republican majority in the House and Senate. That's not only going to make it easier for them to implement executive orders and take executive actions, but to codify really harmful policies and to ensure that they live on beyond any one administration. We do know that there are a number of conservative think tanks that have outlined an explicitly pro-life administration and associated staffing that would mainstream an anti-rights agenda across all issues and agencies, not just global health, not just some of our more tried and true areas where these issues tend to come up. And we know that foreign assistance broadly is going to be heavily debated. and that international family planning and reproductive health will be among those issues and those funding decisions that will be quite contentious. We do also know that among some of the executive orders that are probably awaiting President-elect Trump is a continuation of his Schedule F initiative, which would put something like 50,000 civil servants' jobs at risk, from day one. So we're really looking at a different administration and different makeup of Congress here. Among other things that we will be watching, as I alluded to, I think there's going to be a mainstreaming of some of these anti-rights actors across all agencies and at all levels. But in terms of the higher level positions, we will be looking, closely to see how the White House, State Department, USAID, and other agencies are engaging in some of these spaces, who they're appointing, and what their explicit policy positions are and have been. On this list, you'll note that there are 2 positions that have an asterisk next to them. Those 2 positions do not currently exist, but they've been proposed by conservative think tanks as places where that anti-choice agenda could be elevated and further mainstreamed. What we know so far is that Representative Mike Waltz has been named for a national security advisor. Mike Waltz is a former Green Beret and has some policy chops from his time in Congress. He has previously supported legislation like the Keeping Girls in School Act. He was a co-chair of the Women, Peace, and Security Caucus. I think this could potentially be a small glimmer of hope for us, that there is someone who understands some of the nuanced discussions around gender equality, women's rights, the importance of ensuring that girls have access to educational opportunities and are able to make choices about their futures. In the form of Secretary of State, we've seen Senator Marco Rubio named. Historically, he has held some positions around issues like child marriage that do intertwine with sexual and reproductive health and rights. Although we've seen him skewing further and further right in recent years, and he has a very explicitly anti-choice track record that I think is deeply concerning and could be a very bad signal in terms of the way that U.S. foreign policy and foreign assistance is conducted with this administration. Similarly, Representative Elise Stefanik has been named for the permanent representative to the United Nations. As a member of Congress, she has been very vocal and critical in calling out the United Nations on a number of issues, but also specifically targeting UNFPA. I think positioning someone who has stated a lack of support for the UN in a position to lead engagement with the UN is an interesting signal in terms of what this administration will do. And then just beyond these roles and these potential folks that we're seeing here, we anticipate that the Trump-Vance administration is likely going to nominate anti-SRHR advocates as special representatives, envoys, ambassadors, in order to conduct U.S. foreign policy and influence the drafting of UN resolutions and reports, policy statements, technical literature, and to just ensure that they're assailing gender equality, curtailing human rights, and degrading SRHR globally. These diplomats may also try to reinvigorate a coalition of signatories to the Geneva Consensus Declaration, a document that undermines human rights and was rightfully never adopted by the UN. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but we just anticipate that these actors and some of the configuration of folks that have been named so far are likely going to jeopardize funding for international family planning and reproductive health through the U.S. Global Health Programs and Economic Support Fund. I also just want to note that there are a few statutory restrictions that are still in place and have been in place since the 70s and 80s. I won't go too deeply into them because my colleague Craig Lasher will give a much better overview, but the Helms Amendment, which has been encapsulated in law since 1973, restricts the ability of U.S. funding to be used for abortion services, counseling, or referral. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, 86% of countries receiving U.S. global health assistance allow for abortion in at least one circumstance. Importantly, this is a very controversial amendment. As recently as FY22, the House was able to pass a state and foreign operations bill without language reiterating the Helms Amendment, and legislation has been introduced that would permanently repeal the Helms Amendment. It works in such a way as to really restrict U.S. foreign assistance funding, even in cases where abortion is legal and would be life-saving. The Siljander Amendment, in theory, states that no administration should be able to use U.S. foreign assistance to lobby for or against abortion in other countries. It's traditionally only been applied to one half of that equation, though. And I flag it here because I think we would welcome partners in monitoring the totality of the U.S. law here. All foreign assistance activities, not just global health, are subjected to Siljander. And I do think that lobbying against abortion is equally something that should be monitored and looked at as it pertains to U.S. law. And finally, the Kemp-Kasten Amendment, although it doesn't explicitly call out UNFPA, has only ever been applied to UNFPA and was pretty specifically imposed to target UNFPA. The rationale for it has never been strong, and evaluations by the U.S. government and others have found no evidence to justify the imposition of the Kemp-Kasten Amendment. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what it pertains to, but in theory, it is meant to curtail any U.S. funding being used around coercive reproductive health practices. But again, there has never been any justification for the imposition of the Kemp-Kasten Amendment and its targeting of one specific UN agency. I want to go over some of the top threats. I know I've named a few already, but just to kind of lay them out for you here, we are watching the reinstatement and potential expansion of the global gag rule. The global gag rule restricts foreign NGOs from using funds from any source, including their own funding and non-US government funding for abortion-related services. As I noted, the first Trump administration expanded that gag, which they called the Protecting Life and Global Health Assistance, or PLGHA. They made moves to expand it even beyond global health, which was in and of itself an expansion to other areas of development assistance and other non-US funding streams. The policy does demonstrable harm to health systems, sustainability, and most critically, individuals. And there are proposals within Project 2025 and other conservative think tanks to apply this very broadly, including to US-based NGOs, including to other accounts. So we'll be monitoring closely how this one is written and which funding accounts and recipients it applies to. Regardless of how large or how small the gag rule is, this will kill people. It is a deadly law, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We, as I mentioned, know that there is likely going to be quite a contentious fight around U.S. foreign assistance. We anticipate that this administration is going to be much more transactional in their approach to foreign policy broadly and foreign assistance specifically. And we think that this is going to have broad implications for how the U.S. government engages itself in foreign assistance and specifically in international family planning and reproductive health, both at the executive branch and congressional level. As I noted, we anticipate the defunding of UNFPA, a likely attempt to disengage from the WHO and other UN agencies and multilateral spaces that are responsible for global health and comprehensive sexual education. We also anticipate that the US government will attempt to re-engage in the so-called Geneva Consensus Declaration and reestablish the Commission on Inalienable Rights and implement the Protego standards. As I noted, the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which was not signed in Geneva, is not a consensus and is sort of titled misleadingly, intentionally to make it seem as though it were somehow part of UN doctrine, but was not adopted by the UN, is at its center an anti-abortion agenda. Its supporters hope to remove sexual and reproductive rights from agendas at the UN and within the OAS. It puts that anti-rights agenda ahead of all other considerations and undermines multilateral governance. The declaration has no enforcement power, and the signatories have very problematic records on human rights, particularly for women and vulnerable populations. Protego is a project from the architects of that Geneva Consensus Declaration to operationalize an anti-science, anti-rights, education, health, and foreign policy agenda. So far, it has been launched in, I think, 2 countries, and something like 15 others are considering implementation. The package of that implementation includes tools and trainings to ensure that governments discredit and work against human rights defenders, particularly women's human rights defenders, both within their own countries and to work globally through multilateral fora to undermine SRHR. And finally, I think just as noted, the hiring and appointment of anti-rights leaders across the government is going to be an attempt to ensure that across sectors and at every level, this government is putting an anti-rights agenda forward as something that is central to US foreign policy, which goes counter to what we've seen play out in our elections domestically and what we know from public polling is important to the American people. I'm not going to read all of these to you. Suffice to say, we're watching more than 5 threats. This is going to be quite a time to be monitoring US government and US foreign assistance. We do know that some of the most vulnerable are going to be the most targeted, and that there is going to be a likely prioritization of funding where there is family planning and reproductive health for married heterosexual couples, and that we may see a leaving out of LGBTQ individuals, LGBTQ rights organizations, adolescents, youth, and unmarried individuals, an over-implementation of policies and a chilling effect, and just an overall prioritization of this anti-rights agenda. Craig, I am now going to pass it to you.
Thanks, Rachel. The global gag rule has been mentioned several times by Rachel, and knowing that there are a number of folks on the call who may not be entirely familiar with the details of the global gag rule, and it will be one of the first official actions of the newly inaugurated President Trump shortly after January 20th. And so just to kind of level set on the global gag rule, the global gag rule, when it's been in effect in the past, required foreign NGOs to certify that they don't perform or actively promote abortion as a method of family planning, including providing abortion services, counseling and referral for abortion, or lobbying for the legalization of abortion, the liberalization of abortion laws in their countries, even if they're using funds from any source, including non-US government funds, as a condition of receiving, in the case of prior to the first Trump administration, family planning assistance, and under the first Trump administration, all global health assistance. So the question's been asked in the chat, how much funding is potentially impacted by a global gag rule reinstatement. So prior to Trump, the gag rule only affected family planning and reproductive health assistance in the amount of about $600 million. And that was the case during Republican administrations of Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. It was only applied, the global gag rule was only applied to family planning and reproductive health assistance. Under the first Trump administration, it was expanded all global health assistance, thereby affecting over $7 billion, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation. in the second Trump administration, depending on whether or not they make good on some of the recommendations by the conservative think tanks to apply it to all foreign assistance, as much as $51 billion could be affected. As I mentioned, and as Rachel mentioned, the proposals coming out of Project 2025, a coalition of conservative organizations led by the Heritage Foundation, they propose that the global gag rule apply to all foreign assistance, including health programs in humanitarian settings, a type of health assistance that was exempted under the first Trump administration's PLJHA. So that would be a dramatic expansion of what types of assistance would be subject to these restrictions, but also proposals have been made as to which types of organizations beyond foreign non-governmental organizations would be subject to the restriction, and that would be, and the eligibility condition. The proposals are to expand to U.S. non-governmental organizations, public international organizations, including UN agencies and other multilaterals, and organizations like the Global Fund to combat AIDS, TB, and malaria, and even bilateral government-to-government agreements. So as I said before, it's likely that there'll be an announcement on day one or the first week for sure. Based on past history of prior Republican presidents. But it'll take them a little while to actually draft the standard provisions to be included in organizations and other institutions, grant and cooperative agreements. So one important thing to remember is that that until guidance is issued, organizations and other entities should continue to use non-U.S. government funds for abortion-related activities to the extent they want to pursue those activities. So, I would encourage organizations not to react too quickly. In the prior iterations of the policy, it typically didn't go into the restrictions, didn't go into effects on grants and cooperative agreements until there was new money provided, until there was a new grant agreement or additional funding was added. So over to you, Mustafa.
Great, thank you, Craig, and Rachel, if you can skip to the next slide as well. I think this slide just and we can share this with you. It just highlights the extent to which the U.S. government provides is responsible for the share of total disbursements for family planning foreign assistance worldwide. Going on to the next slide, we just wanted to highlight a little bit many of the things that are already quite familiar to many of you here, but that the reimposition and probable expansion of the expanded global gag rule will have a tremendous effect on people around the world. From the last time the global gag rule was imposed and the expanded global gag rule was imposed, we can anticipate the impact in at least 4 broad categories. One, we can, given that almost all of UNFPA's funding from the U.S. government is at risk, we can be certain that contraceptive supplies will be disrupted. And then because of the disruption in supplies, we can also anticipate that unmet need for modern contraceptives will increase once the global gag rule is imposed. We also know from prior impositions of the global gag rule that access to quality services will be reduced. In the last Republican administration, the reimposition and expansion of the global gag rule resulted in stoppage of mobile reproductive health services for tens of thousands of women in at least 7 West African countries, because the main partners did not sign the global gag rule, resulting in the termination of mobile services. Similarly, in Nepal, the imposition resulted in services that were contributing to more than 60,000 couple years of protection, and over 250 trained staff could no longer perform the services that they had been trained to perform as well. We also know that access to legal and safe abortion services will be reduced. We have very clear documentation from Ethiopia where access to high quality safe abortion services were curtailed as many organizations were unable to receive both US government funding and maintain their abortion services. And also there was a chilling effect. So even in government health facilities, we found that many providers were reluctant to provide services down the line. As you can imagine, the compliance burden will be increasing tremendously as well for everyone. And last time around, my team and I were at the forefront of the compliance burden, and I can tell you from direct experience that the amount of training time, the amount of staff time that goes into managing compliance, understanding compliance, ensuring compliance goes up, and valuable program funding has to be diverted to manage the compliance burden rather than provide services. Going on to the next slide, we will see disruptions in evidence-based and evidence-informed policy. We can expect increases in pushes for abstinence-only programs for young unmarried individuals that happened in Uganda as well the last time around, and that local voices, especially local anti-choice voices, will be emboldened, and the pro-choice voices in health, democracy and governance, gender, women's rights, economic empowerment will be really curtailed given the probable expansion of the global gag rule. So with that, I'll turn over to Rachel to talk a little bit about the kinds of actions we will be taking, and we ask you all to join us in taking moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Mustafa. It's also just helpful to hear sort of how some of these policies in Washington really play out on the ground and the degree to which even compliance can reduce actual healthcare being implemented. So PAI is eager and ready to fight back against these policies. We are going to keep the pressure up on Congress to promulgate pro-SRHR legislation, fund bilateral and multilateral FPRH programs, and to permanently repeal the gag. We have to remember that congressional cycles, some new elections will happen in the midterms. We will have time, even though things look dire now, to push for an agenda. There are a number of pieces of legislation that would work to permanently repeal the gag, repeal Helms, to restore Roe v. Wade domestically, and we will be working with members of Congress to reintroduce those pieces of legislation. We are also looking at new and innovative ways to work with bipartisan actors to ensure that this agenda does not somehow get lost or misconstrued, especially given the fervor with which we saw the American public vote for rights. We know that this is something that the American public cares deeply about. Some of those pieces of legislation that will be reintroduced include the Global HER Act, the Women's Health Protection Act, the Abortion is Healthcare Everywhere Act, the Support for UNFPA Funding Act, and the Greater Leadership for the Benefit of Equality, or the GLOBE Act. That last one advances LGBTQ and human rights globally, in addition to new and other ways of working within the constraints that we are facing with this new makeup of the US government. We are also so eager to engage with partners through the civil society coalitions where we lead, to ensure that we're funding and coordinating advocacy and accountability efforts in the Global South countries to mitigate the US policy harm. We are eager to engage with US constituents, especially young people, and ensure that we're making those connections between what's happening domestically and what's happening globally. And we will be working to ensure that evidence-based data collection occurs to document policy impact through our PAI Access Denied series. Okay.
So there's still work to be done. In particular, finalizing the fiscal year 2025 appropriations process. the U.S. federal government's currently operating under a continuing resolution through December 20th. There's discussion on how to conclude the process this year. House Republican Speaker Mike Johnson yesterday said that a CR will presumably be passed to extend the deadline for final negotiation on an omnibus spending package through March. Appropriations committee members of both parties, including Republicans, would prefer to resolve the FY 2025 appropriations process before the end of the year and the adjournment of the 118th Congress, knowing that it may be important to and just makes things less chaotic if they can clear the deck for the arrival of the 119th Congress and the new president. Their fears are justified because in 2017, the first year of the first Trump administration, it required 3 CRs before an omnibus was approved, and not until the first week in May, which was 7 months into the fiscal year. All-time record, I think, and certainly in my recollection. If the final resolution on FY 2025 gets pushed into the new year and the new Congress, it makes the prospects for preserving the status quo on international family planning, funding, and policy more treacherous. As many of you know, for the last 14 years, funding for international family planning has been stagnant at a little over $600 million. And there has been no policy change, either positive or negative, either legislative codification of the gag rule, or from our side, a legislative repeal of the gag rule to prevent a president from unilaterally imposing the gag rule, as newly inaugurated President Trump is likely to do. So stay tuned for that. And for more information, you should subscribe to our Washington memo. Over.
Thank you, Craig. To wrap up, and Sarah, if you could go to the previous slide, please. To wrap up, we are here as a resource, and you can see the contact information of colleagues who presented here. So take note of that, and of course, reach out to us. You can go to the next slide, Sarah. So in essence, we are here as a resource. We are here as a partner to you, and we'll continue to be unwavering and dedicated to meeting the global health needs and desires of communities around the world. And I know we're going to do this together. I know there was a lot that we shared, and I also hope that each of you took away the opportunities that we have to come together. We know that alongside each of you, with members of coalitions in the US and around the world, and of course in partnership with our extended ecosystem of 1,800 community-based organizations, change is possible. And what we ultimately want to do is ensure that our movement is sustained and that it's vibrant and that it is both of those things globally. So thank you for your courage, for your partnership, and for your support. We look forward to sharing more analysis in the coming weeks and months, and also hosting additional community sessions. We'll now move into Q&A, so please post your questions in the Q&A function, which you'll find on the bottom right side of your Zoom screen. And as I noted, our team is also available here for further conversations one-on-one or with small groups, so please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you again.
Thanks, Navia. As she said, we're going to move into Q&A. We have the Q&A function at the bottom, so go ahead and put them in. As we received those, we did receive a few questions via email ahead of time. So the first one I'm going to ask is, we're still discovering the impacts of the first time this was put into place, the expanded global gag rule under Trump. When can we expect to see impacts this go around if it is indeed reinstated? So that is open to all three of you, whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, I'll jump in first, and we will start seeing impacts, I think, depending on the timing. This time around, this administration is much more prepared, so we can expect that relatively quickly the modifications that have to go into U.S. government agreements once the expanded global gag rule is reimposed, and those modifications will kick in relatively quickly into agreements that are being held by current program. So that should happen within a couple of months or a few months of this administration coming into power. The expansion, if that happens, of the gag rule to all foreign aid assistance may take a little longer. It has to go through legal review, make sure it meets standards. So that may take a lot longer, maybe 6 or 8 months down the line, possibly longer, depending on the extent of legal reviews that have to take place. So just to give you a sense of where they are, the materials are ready for the old PLGHA, so all that should come through very, very quickly. The training materials are there, they just have to be reinitiated, and so the compliance standards will be pretty quick to roll out this time around. Craig, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, but that's the anticipation.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. I mean, I think we need to wait and see what the announcement says, and I think we'll get a sense of how they're going to plan on going out, implementing the policy, and whether they'll continue to do what they did in the last iterations of, not retroactively applying the restrictions and, waiting until there's new awards or additional funding to existing awards. So if it passed as prologue, it may take a little while to kick in.
Yeah, I'll just add before we move to the next question that we're still seeing a lot of the chilling effects from the first PLGHA, and rescinding and implementing the gag rule doesn't just go away with the wave of a magic wand. What happens when this rule is imposed is that some clinics are forced to close. Some individuals are not able to receive services, and that can be life-threatening. There are a number of studies that have documented the impact of the gag rule and the degree to which it's already been over-implemented. So I would just caution partners on the call to please not implement the policy or the gag rule until it is in place. And to really look to that guidance and stay within the parameters of what you can and can't do. But it does just cause such a chilling effect that is much more broad than what it has previously been written as. So would caution folks to just wait until that comes out, and to note that even though it's not in place right now, those impacts are still being seen today.
Thank you, all three of you. Craig, did you have something to add? I think you're on mute.
I just wanted to say that in addition to the actions that PAI will take that Rachel listed, we will do what we've done during previous impositions of versions of the gag rule. Is put out a very detailed what you need to know guide in as far as to organizations.
Thank you. We're getting a lot of great questions, so I'm gonna ask them, and hopefully we can give speedy responses so we can get through most of them. One, or actually two questions. What do you think the prospects are for the domestic abortion ban? And what are the chances of the GGR being permanent? So whoever would like to take that first.
I don't really want to speak to domestic policy. That's not my wheelhouse. I think there is a real risk that this administration does not make good on some promises not to impose bans or not to harm certain populations. I do think that, sorry, what was the second part of the question? It just disappeared. Oh, the chances of the GGR being permanent. So this would take both bodies of Congress passing legislation and then having that be signed into law by the president to permanently instate the global gag rule. I think there's a non-zero chance of that happening. I do think if that legislation were to be proposed and to be put forward, there's also just a great opportunity for those of us on this call and those in the community to really rally around this. The global gag rule is intentionally hard to describe because of the nefarious and multi-pronged ways in which it harms people. It is written in a way that is meant to obfuscate what the US government is trying to do and the ways in which it is trying to hamstring other governments from using their own money, other countries from implementing their own laws. And I do hope that such legislation is not put forward, but if it is, I hope that it can be leveraged as an opportunity for the American public to see what we're doing with our foreign policy and the ways in which we're hurting people abroad.
Thanks, Rachel. Just a note, we're going to extend the webinar by about 15 minutes. We really want to answer your questions and be a resource to all of you. If you have to jump off at 1 o'clock, no problem. We'll send a recording. But for others that are able to stay on, we will be extending it. With that, I'm going to move to the next question. Someone has asked, is there analysis of which countries are particularly reliant on USG SRHR funding and therefore most at risk of the impact? Great question.
I can try and take that on as well. There is some analysis. We know that for family planning, USAID has 30 core countries, but within that, there's 24 countries that receive the bulk of the funding for their family planning initiatives, most of them in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. So we can expect that effect to be directly affecting those countries. If the budget gets zeroed out, or if the rules are imposed, then it'll have an effect on the services that are being delivered through the existing partners for USAID. But if the expanded global gag rule is imposed, then that effect is much larger. And then also keep in mind that because UNFPA funding is affected, that affects contraceptive procurement in 173 countries. So that's a much more distributed group of countries that get affected because their contraceptive supplies get affected down the line as well. So it is, yes, and we'll continue to be monitoring it and providing updates as we receive information about who's getting affected and how. We do rely on our network of partners and all of you to get that information down the line.
Thanks. We're actually getting a few questions about Project 2025, not shocked. Basically, a few folks are asking, what do we envision in terms of support or not for gender equity efforts, given the language in Project 2025, and kind of what we can expect for foreign assistance that is provided to governments. So, Project 2025.
I'm happy to take this one. I think it's important to know that while the Heritage Foundation is made up of a lot of former, or the Project 2025 arm of it anyway, is made up of a lot of former Trump officials and Trump affiliates. That proposal is not the official policy proposal of the Trump campaign or future Trump administration. So I think there are some really terrifying proposals within that document, and I am ever hopeful that they will not all be implemented. I do think the question around gender and gender equality is a good one because we have seen in Congress and elsewhere efforts to undermine the use of those terms and return to a more women and girls type of nomenclature and approach. I do think that there will be an overall undermining of women's rights, of gender equality, and many of the approaches and positions that have been situated within the US government. Project 2025 recommends firing all of the gender advisors that USAID has at mission, that have really enabled that agency to ensure that all programs and projects are not unintentionally harming vulnerable populations, and a really intentional attempt to misconstrue what the word gender means and why it's important for effective foreign assistance. I think that part is going to come true. And
yeah.
PAI remains steadfast in fighting against that.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. So we also have another question. When do we think, do we think the executive order coming from the White House will be made public or leaked before inauguration?
I can take that one. In the past, the announcement on or about the Roe v. Wade anniversary, the third week in January, shortly after the inauguration on January 20th, has taken the form of a presidential memorandum rather than an executive order. Presidential memorandum sent to the Secretary of State, the USAID administrator, and in the most recent Trump expansion in the first term, to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. We probably won't see it in advance. I don't think we've ever seen it in prior reimpositions. So, it would be closely held by the transition team.
Not the situation with SCOTUS. Thanks for that. So we're getting a few more questions. I will note that we're going to be sending out some resources and materials after this webinar. And again, if you have questions that we don't get to, feel free to email any of us and we're happy to answer them. So the next question we have is, can we expect other government donors to step in and fill the funding gap? Maybe Mustafa, you could take this one.
To the extent that I can, okay. And I think the tea leaves are much harder to read this time. Last time around, I have to say a lot of European donors did kick in a big way, and came across and coalesced together very quickly to fill in some of the gaps. Still, as the chart that we shared earlier showed, the U.S. government provides such a big bulk of global health assistance, and about a third of all family planning, reproductive health assistance, foreign assistance in the world, that it's really hard for other governments to meet that need. Now, what has changed in the 8 years since the last imposition of the expanded global gag rule is there have been a lot of changes in Europe as well, where there's significant right-wing governments that have come into power, and even where we have favorable governments like the UK, with FCDO, they've already announced that there's not going to be any increase in their foreign assistance budget until 2030 at the latest because of their budget deficits, and that a big chunk of the money will be used to support the UK's refugee and displaced people's programs as well, and those will be diverted. The Netherlands government also just announced that they're going to be significantly reducing their foreign aid assistance budgets, and we've heard something similar from Sweden, and we're hearing something similar from Germany and Italy and elsewhere as well. So we really can't, we should be really careful about thinking about the extent to which our European governments will be kicking in to support it. And then at the national level, the governments are really stretched. We're hearing more and more about their increased debt burdens. So where they find the money to then fill in the gaps for their own population's needs is going to be increasingly difficult as well, because they're paying off more in just managing the interest on the debt that they've accrued than they're receiving in foreign aid assistance. So this ask would mean going even deeper into deficit than they have been already. So it's a particular time where we can't expect the gap to be filled so easily anymore.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to a question from Jessica Ogden. Maybe Rachel, you can take this one. I see that you started answering it, but for everyone on the call. I've also heard that the America First Policy Institute's platform will be influential, possibly even, it's moved, possibly even more than Project 2025. Any comment on that, Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I just to say it's very important to see all of these policy proposals laid out. I think the Heritage Foundation, CFAM's America First agendas of the world have detailed a lot of their policy priorities, and these are of the strong voices that the president-elect and his administration will be listening to. I think the America First agenda is a little bit light on foreign policy, so it's harder to read the tea leaves there, but that's also probably important to note that it's light on foreign policy and really focused on policies here at home and what something like that might mean for the incoming administration and how they think, again, more transactionally about our foreign assistance programs. But yeah, I think they're all very important reads.
Thanks. I have a question for Craig. Why were we not able to get permanent repeal of the GGR through the Global Her Act when we were under a Biden administration?
Why are you asking me that question?
I had
I mean, basically, the first 2 years of the Biden-Harris administration, we did have a trifecta, the same as the Republicans will enjoy in the 119th Congress. The short answer is the Democratic leaders in the small room decided that they had other priorities, and therefore, even though a legislative codification of a global gag rule repeal to prevent a future president hostile to SRHR couldn't oppose it unilaterally. I guess it's important to note that the reason why we've ended up with the status quo for the last 14 years is because international family planning, reproductive health issues, funding, and policy are typically among the last items to be negotiated in the end game negotiation, and literally at the level of the speaker, the majority and minority leaders in the House and Senate, and maybe the chair and ranking members of the Appropriations Committee. So it's a really small, high-level discussion where, major national and party priorities are dealt with. So, as much as we're disappointed in that outcome, it we got traded away for other priorities. And the same may happen, if we find ourselves in a negotiation amongst with Republican control of both the House and the Senate, and Donald Trump in the White House. You may still have a situation where they can't get it done. So I mean, that's the hope for sure. But it's something we have to remain vigilant about, at least for the next 2 years, and perhaps even in the final resolution of the FY 2025 appropriations process. There is a legislative codification of the global gag rule contained in the House Republican passed bill. Senate bill is silent. So it's within the realm of possibility, hopefully not a strong possibility, but nevertheless not off the table by any means. I mean, we would be very fortunate to end up in a continuation of the status quo for the 15 years in a row. That would be a significant accomplishment.
Yeah, that definitely would be. Thank you. Another question that we got via email was, how do these policies, perhaps even if we pull out of the WHO, how does that affect the US global leadership, perhaps how we are perceived by other countries? So if anyone would like to take that one.
That's a tough one. Okay, yeah. We're already viewed rather suspiciously, I think, but then moving forward, I think it's going to be an interesting bag, right? So I think when it comes to UN agencies, they're definitely going to be affected in terms of the kinds of conversations they are able to have with the US government counterparts, or how they perceive whatever information they're receiving from the US government. And I think some of the discussions that they have with each other may end up being rather contentious. On the flip side, as I'm kind of monitoring some of the sites out there, I'm noticing that the anti-choice voices are really beginning to gear up strongly. In many of the countries we're working in, we're already seeing a strong reaction in Kenya, in Uganda, and other countries where they're gearing up for it to be moving forward much faster, and taking that on to make big changes or propose big changes in national health and development policy and priorities as well. So I think that's how we'll perceive it. It's going to be a mixed bag depending on which regimes are in power, how the message of the incoming administration resonates with the kind of priorities they believe should be advocated for or not moving forward.
Thanks for that. Going back to Craig, I missed this when you were speaking. Someone has asked, it would require 60 votes in the Senate, correct?
Yes, the new Senate Majority Leader John Thune announced yesterday that he is going to preserve the legislative filibuster rule. So the problem is any sort of legislative codification of the global gag rule would be contained in a much larger bill with a lot of other issues. And so it's complicated. So the requirement of 60 votes doesn't necessarily protect us from bad legislation being enacted.
Thank you. I personally, this is really heavy. It's been pretty rough. And so I want to ask something else. Craig and Rachel, maybe Craig, you can go first. You're both kind of neck deep in our US government analysis. Being in that, is there anything that is giving you hope? Please give us hope.
I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat it. I don't think that there is, at least for the next couple of years, a really bright, shiny future where we all rally and fight and can push back against all of the harm that has been proposed and is likely to be imposed. I do think that reproductive rights continue to be very popular among the American people. And I think during the first Trump administration, there were a number of successes when civil society organizations came together when we rallied our members of Congress, and we were able to push back again. And, you know, even under this last Congress, there have been a number of really harmful policy proposals that we've been successful in pushing back against. So I would say my hope is in organizations like PAI and our colleagues. We are here for this fight, and even though we don't welcome it and wish this is sort of not the situation we were in, this is something that has been bubbling up and that we anticipated and we're ready to fight against and fight for reproductive rights.
Totally. Thank you. Craig, if you have anything to add? So I'm looking at the time and I don't think we have any other questions. I think we've answered them all, but again, you can reach out to us if you didn't get a chance to ask it. I'm going to go ahead and close us out. Thank you so much to everyone that joined. Thank you to our three speakers, Mustafa, Craig, and Rachel. I learned something and I work with you guys. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, have a great day.